Well, thanks so much for joining us today. As always, I appreciate when you choose to spend your time here, and we always strive to give you lots of value to make that worthwhile. And today's no exception. We're going to be chatting today with Dr. Jennifer Nash about negotiating with human leadership. So welcome, Jennifer. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Cindy.
Yeah, and for those of you who may not know her, Jennifer Nash is the founder and CEO of Jennifer Nash Coaching and Consulting. She's a leadership development consultant and an author who helps Fortune 50 organizations prioritize people to power performance. We can all use a bit more of that. She's earned her MBA, her PhD, her PCC, and serves as an adjunct faculty at the University of Michigan. She's presented this groundbreaking leadership and coaching research at Harvard and Columbia University. So definitely comes to us with some chops around this issue. And she's also the author of the best-selling and award-winning book, Be Human, Lead Human. So we're going to be hearing about that. So let's jump right in. Jennifer, it strikes me that with the world seemingly becoming less connected from human contact perspective, what is human leadership and why is it needed? I think I know, but I'd love to hear your input on that.
Mhm. Yeah, so, it's so interesting to me that today, we have technology that brings us closer and closer together through screens. But at the same time, it's also dividing us, right?
Yeah.
We are losing this ability to connect human to human, in-person conversations. We see, in some of the younger generations, there's a preference to text people, even if they're sitting across from you,
I know.
and just talk to them, right?
Yeah.
So, when I say human leadership, what I'm referring to is this ability to look at people as whole human beings, not just an employee who can deliver output for your organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. So important. It's funny as you were saying that I was chuckling because I remember with my kids, even when they were younger, and my guys weren't, we were sort of we doled out tech in small increments to them. So they were a bit of the exception, but they'd have kids over for parties, they'd be in the same circle and they're texting each other. I'd go downstairs going, what is going on?
Right.
Does nobody talk to anybody anymore?
Right.
And,
Right.
I admit I'm a bit of a old school myself. Like, if I go into a bank, I won't use ATM. I will stand in the
Mhm.
lineup and they're like, you can use the ATM. And I'm like, no, I'm saving your job.
Right.
So,
Right.
now
Yeah.
are leaders connecting with their people on a human level today? And, if not, what do you think is missing, if anything?
It's a great question because I think what leaders have learned up until now is the role modeling of leadership from the leaders that came before them. So if those leaders were interacting with people one-on-one and talking to them and, making those personal connections, then likely the leaders are doing that today. But what I hear so often from clients is that, their leaders don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
It's rare that they get FaceTime with their leaders. I also hear a lot that, my leader just doesn't know, they don't know what's important to me. They don't know what motivates me. They don't know why I come to work aside from a paycheck. And so I think there's an opportunity here for leaders to rethink how they practice and think about leadership.
Yeah.
What does that look like specifically since the pandemic? Because before the pandemic, we could maybe get away with, hiding behind, measuring projects and measuring tasks and thinking that we were leading people. But as you know, those are two very different skill sets.
Yeah.
And so when COVID hit, all of a sudden leaders couldn't do it anymore. And they're thinking to themselves, well, how do I lead these people not only remotely, but how do I deal with, the messiness of life that Zoom all of a sudden introduced
Yeah.
to everyone's world, because before we had these carefully constructed facades of who we were and how we showed up at work. And then all of a sudden, when COVID hit and Zoom came on the scene without the blur function, we saw everything happening, right? And then blur came into place, and then everything sort of like, shifted a
Yeah.
little bit. But so I think so that's a very long way of saying I think there's an opportunity for leaders to change how they are thinking about and practicing leadership to show up in a way that brings the human element back to the forefront of business.
Yeah, I love that you're doing this work, Jennifer. And frankly, it was one of the things that prompted me to start the art of feminine negotiation mission, if you will. It was more just seeing, my gosh, the world is, and this is pre-COVID, the world is so out of balance, and we're using these traditional, more competitive models of leadership, that sort of top-down approach, power over approach, rather than bringing compassion and collaboration to the table. So, and COVID certainly brought a seismic shift. I think people are starting to recognize that those so-called feminine skills that we saw as a liability are actually the most important leadership skills. And, one of the hallmarks of, the art of feminine negotiation is trust, right? And I believe that's the case for great leadership too. I think ironically, the skills that make for great negotiators are the skills that make for great leaders. So I'd love if
Yeah.
you talk for a minute about why is trust so important and why do a lot of leaders not trust their employees?
Oh, those are two great questions. So the first one is, why is trust so important? Trust is the bedrock. It is the glue that creates the interactions and creates the outcomes in the workplace.
Yeah,
So if we don't trust each other and we don't even maybe trust ourselves, we're not going to get the outcomes that we're looking for,
yeah,
either for ourselves or for the organization.
yeah,
So things need to start with trust. And somewhere between when we're born and we innately trust, right? And when we enter the workplace, we're taught that people have to earn our trust.
that's true.
So it's a very interesting shift that happens between when we're born and when we go into the workplace. And I would invite your listeners to think about, well, where did that paradigm shift for you? And where did you learn that people had to earn your trust rather than you freely give it to them, as when we were younger?
Yeah.
So that is something for people to think about.
Yeah,
I
I like that perspective. It's true. There's so many things when you think of it. I often
Yeah,
talk about negotiation, invoke your inner child. There's so many things we did as kids and we had it right, like intuitively. It was like
yeah,
nature impact. And then we got conditioned out of it, right? Conditioned
yeah,
out of our curiosity, conditioned
yeah,
into fear. I mean, all of these things that are
yeah.
major blocks. So what would you say is like the number one thing that a leader could do right now to be a human leader, to step into your model?
I think the number one thing that a person can do to be a human leader is to ask questions. So often, you had asked why, do leaders not trust more in the workplace? And I think a primary reason for that is because they aren't confident in their own abilities and in the abilities of those around them to get the work done.
Yeah.
And so that manifests in micromanaging. It manifests in telling others what to do. It manifests in perhaps taking credit for the work. It manifests in all these different ways that aren't necessarily positive.
Yeah.
But when you lead from a place of trusting first, it accelerates performance and
Yeah.
it accelerates how people come together, collaborate, communicate, connect, and deliver. And so we look, high trust organizations outperform low trust organizations by
Yeah.
286%.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I want to really put a pin in that for our listeners because I think most of us we do that earn trust, but it's also that we're so conditioned. There's a very ego-driven approach. We talked a second ago about that power over versus power with. And when we're taking that kind of top-down approach, we often micromanage instead of giving people the latitude, giving them the latitude to make mistakes and learn from them, right? Have that kind of trust and coming from a place rather surrendering ego, I guess, in our leadership models. So important. Now let's face it, I mean, there are a lot of bad leaders out there today, and for our listeners who maybe are dealing with one, do you have any advice for people who are working with leaders who don't embrace the human element? What can they do? What should they do?
Yeah. I like to think positive about people, right? That's typically my default. And so I like to assume that when leaders are, having these challenges as they often have, like I don't think that people get up in the morning and say, you know what, I want to go to work and have a terrible day. I want to cause all the people around me to be in a bad mood. I want to micromanage everybody, right? I don't think that really happens, but that's my perspective.
Yeah.
So I do know that we have out there leaders, and I want to separate this and be very clear about this. We have leaders who exhibit toxic behaviors. We do not have toxic leaders. We have
Mm,
people, human beings, who exhibit toxic behaviors. And so when we separate the person from the problem, then we can start to look at what should leaders be doing to remove these toxic behaviors, right? How can they replace them with more human leader behaviors? And like I mentioned earlier, one of the first things the leader can do is ask questions. And I think the same is true for the employee. If the employee is having challenges with their leader or with their manager, with the person they're directly reporting to, the first thing they can start to do, instead of assuming negative and
Yeah.
assuming all of these bad things, is to ask themselves the question, well, what is going on with this person?
Yeah.
What is causing them to behave in this way? Why do they have these patterns of behavior? What are they thinking that is causing them to act in this way? And sometimes when we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes, and many people will call that empathy or sympathy, we can look at it from a different perspective and have a greater understanding. That understanding gives us a little bit more patience and a little bit more tolerance to really take a step back, not take it personally, and think about what is actually happening here. And then when you have those data points that are driven by data and not by emotion, you can then make a decision what is right for you. Do you stay in that employer, in that organization where it's maybe not working so well for you? Or do you try to have a conversation with this person who's exhibiting these behaviors and figure out how you can have a better interaction and a better relationship?
Uh, I am loving, you are totally speaking my language, Jennifer, let me tell you, because I mean, these are core elements of, I call it the art of feminine negotiation, but I love this human leadership approach. And I really like that you put a pin in this idea about separating the toxic, like, we always talk about toxic masculinity, for example.
Right.
And, I like to call it masculine toxicity because it's not that being masculine is toxic. There's
No.
all kinds of toxicity. There's feminine toxicity, you name it, right? So I love
Right.
that. So, and it's kind of like with kids, when we say it's not a bad kid, it's bad behavior, make sure that you separate that out. I think that's so important. And I also really want to put a pin for our listeners. You'll notice that, Dr. Nash is talking here a lot about asking questions. And I call it the art of curiosity, or the art of fascination. It is
Mhm.
such a game changer when you can show up from a place of listening and asking powerful questions. And as you touched on that empathy, really good active listening comes from a place of empathy. Put yourself truly in the shoes of the other person to try and listen and understand and consider. We all have stuff going on. I don't always show up as the best version of myself. And I challenge any of you out there listening to think
Yep.
that you always have. My gosh, menopause, holy embarrassment, right? I mean, I was being irrational, recognizing in the moment that I was being irrational and not able to change it. So I love your approach to this, Jennifer. And considering sort of the evolving nature, you mentioned about COVID, and I think that and many other factors have led to this evolving nature of work environments, right? A lot more people
Yes.
working from home, a lot of,
Yes.
less bricks and mortars, very different models. How can human leadership principles be adapted for these hybrid or kind of flexible work arrangements?
Yeah, I think human leadership dovetails nicely with a hybrid work arrangement or a work from home arrangement. I think, with human leadership, it's also presuming that, the people that are working with you and for you, they're adults.
Yeah.
They can manage
Yeah.
themselves. They want autonomy, right? They deserve autonomy. And they had autonomy during COVID.
Yeah.
And so to try to think that we're going to go back to what we had before COVID, it's not happening.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of leaders, unfortunately, who are stuck in that mindset of, well,
Yeah.
if we could just go back to status quo, prior to 2020, everything would be fine. Well, that's not the case, and we're not going backwards. And I think what's going to happen is if leaders can't get on board with hybrid and with remote, which is here to stay,
Yeah.
they're going to be looking for employees and they won't be talent magnets
Yeah.
and they won't be employers of choice. And so they have a decision to make. Where do they want to fall on that spectrum and
Yeah.
how do they want to appear to potential talent?
Yeah. Yeah. I often say, I mean, if they don't get their head out of the sand, they're going to go the way of the dodo bird, right? I mean, it's just,
Yep.
we're in a, and not even just about the bricks and mortar versus, working from home, et cetera, but on issues of diversity and profound shifts we're seeing on issues of gender or sexual orientation or race and diversity. I mean, unless we open our eyes to so many people, I think, who believed that they were the sort of benefactors, if you will, of those, or benefiters of those systems, are resistant, saying, why can't we just go back? We can't go back to the way things were. Now, tied to that, it's tied a lot to our beliefs, right? I'm a big believer
Yes.
that, the thoughts that we create about situations and the meaning that we attach to them, they create our beliefs, which create our reality. So are
Yes.
there certain beliefs that you think maybe hinder us from practicing these human-centered leadership approaches, even for those who maybe genuinely aspire to adopt it or believe that they are on the path to adopting it? What kind of beliefs would hinder that?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. Cindy, there's so many.
Yeah.
And I think often what happens is we're not even aware of these beliefs that we have that are
Yeah.
generating these actions and behaviors. And it takes a little bit of stepping back and reflection and self-awareness to really understand what's driving that. So one of the behaviors and one of the thinking and mindset beliefs that is opposite of human leadership is this idea that people have to earn your trust,
Yeah.
right? That's a thought pattern, probably based on some data points in your background of why that is so, but you didn't come out of the womb that way.
Yeah.
So where did that happen? Why did it happen? And how is it getting in the way of your performance today?
Yeah.
And if it's not impacting your performance positively, then what belief do you need to shift and change in order to help you get that to where you want to be and perform at the level you need to?
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Now, I find that, having been a practicing attorney for over 30 years, lawyers in particular, it can get very stuck. And I probably take some flack from our lawyers out in the audience here today. But I'd love your thoughts specifically on that. Like, how can, within the legal profession, I often talk about practicing with more purpose. What are some ways that maybe lawyers or other professions for that matter can show up with this sort of human approach to get
Mhm.
better outcomes?
Oh, that's a great question. So often when you think about the different professions, there's many professions where we are professionally trained to engineer the humanity out of
Yeah.
the equation. And that often happens in the STEM area,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
But it also happens in legal. It also
Yeah.
happens in medicine. I mean, it happens in many
True.
of these finance, accounting, all these different spaces where maybe the focus isn't on people, it's on numbers and data.
Yeah.
And so when you think about how you can reverse engineer that, I think it really starts with looking at the set of beliefs and assumptions that you have about how you're operating today and where do people fall in those? Do they even figure into those? And likely they don't. And so then you
Yeah.
can ask yourself, what is the desired outcome of this? How do people
Yeah.
figure into this? If you're a lawyer, you're dealing with clients all day. You're dealing with people, unless you're a
Yeah.
corporate lawyer, but you're still dealing with people that
Yeah.
represent the corporation. So, how is it that you could then change how you interact or change your process or procedure to integrate some more of that human element and let it come to the forefront?
Yeah. I love that. I love that. I think that's a great answer. And it was really interesting because as you were listing some of the industries, I was going, oh my gosh, because you think STEM, accounting, finance, law, medicine.
Mhm.
Ironically, or interestingly, all of those professions, if you will, or industries are ones that historically had been male dominated. And again, it
Yeah.
reinforces for me this idea about, and when and I don't think it's male female, and people often get put off when I talk about, feminine negotiation. It's not about being a woman versus, it's about so-called masculine versus feminine traits. And I think we're getting away, thank goodness, from that terminology. So it'll be moot soon. But again, for our listeners, really putting a pin in about maybe rethinking how you approach rather than showing up with that chest beating kind of energy, that win-lose energy, whether in business or in your professionally or personally.
Mhm.
Maybe bring that softer approach, more collaborative approach, that curiosity that Dr. Nash, is talking about, to
Mhm.
find better ways to
Yeah.
show up, better ways to get outcomes, better relationships, better buy-in, the whole gambit.
Mhm.
Now, I
Mhm.
think given where we're at today with all of the kind of seismic shifts we're talking about, this
Mhm.
idea might seem a little overwhelming to some. So for somebody who's like, okay, I haven't been doing that and I'd like to start, what are some simple steps that people can take, some action towards prioritizing people for better performance or just for better relationships for that matter?
Yeah. So one of the steps people can take, it's very simple. They can go online to my website and they can take my Human Leader Index. It's a complimentary index which gives them a personalized assessment of their results and then gives them some ideas on where they can look to see where they fall on that Human Leader Index scale, and then some suggestions and recommendations on what they can do to move the needle in the direction they choose.
Nice.
So that's a very simple way to start, and it gives them some ideas on how they can start to think about the different concepts that go into human leadership. So I have what's called a humans framework, which has 6 different dimensions of human leadership, and it's based on relationships. So that forms the 7th dimension
Yeah.
of the framework. I talk about that framework in my book. So if they like the Human Leader Index, they can then go pick up a copy of the book wherever they choose to purchase books. That has a lot of different stories in it, and they can see in real life some of these stories of human leadership and what that looks like in practice. Because we don't often see what that looks like in practice in the news, right? We
Yeah.
often get the negative things on the
Yeah.
news. And so seeing things, what it really looks like in practice is helpful for people because it's
Yeah.
told in a story format. So it's not this, esoteric, dissertation like book. It's a very relatable, easy to read is what I hear from readers.
Yeah. Nice.
So they can start with that.
Yeah, beautiful. And it's funny, I think you're being generous when you say it's often not the case that we get that sort of in the news. I'd say sadly, it's a majority of the time. Our media seems to be
Yeah.
so fear-based, so negative-based. And, you hear over and over again how, negative news sells more, and apparently it's all
Yeah.
about money.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it does, right? And if you it there's a reason for that, right? We are wired evolutionarily speaking, we are wired to pay attention to the negative
yeah,
because that signaled danger.
yeah,
And if we didn't pay attention to that, we could die.
yeah,
So there is a reason why I think it's focused on that, but it's not always the most pleasant thing to see. I think another thing that might be of interest to your listeners is I don't know where they're all based, but if they are in the US, it may be of interest to them to take a look at how the current Democratic nominee is
yeah,
running their campaign. I have not seen one negative ad
yeah,
come from that candidate yet. And I think it's so fascinating because it's really changing. It's a seismic shift in how the race is being run,
yeah.
how the candidates are interacting with one another, and what the behaviors are. And it's
Yeah.
fascinating to watch this unfold in real time.
Oh, especially seeing the bold distinction between the Democratic sort of campaign
Yes,
versus the Republican campaign in this. And it's
yes.
interesting you say that. I literally just did a special episode on that and had somebody coming speaking to exactly that point. What are some things we can learn from, and how do we negotiate navigating, making the best choice for us and things to look for? So I love that you mentioned that. Now, what's one of you'd mentioned about your book, and we'll make sure to put all that information in the show notes for our listeners if you were furiously trying to look up on the side. Okay, how do I find this stuff? What's one of the most surprising things that you discovered while researching for your book, Jennifer?
Oh my goodness. There were so many. I think one of the things that really stood out to me as I looked at the human examples of human leadership was that there was this mindset that, in the past, organizations were viewed as a place where people could just work, right? You go to
Yeah,
work, you do your work, and go home. And what I saw over, the people that I interviewed and the stories that they told about leading in a human way was that they really viewed organizations as places where people could not only work, but they came there to grow as
yeah,
well. Right. So looking at this developmental aspect of someone and thinking about how do I support this person in growing and evolving and becoming their best human self they can possibly
yeah,
be, that impacts that person on so many different levels. And it impacts the organization because you're going to get the best out of that person.
yeah, yeah.
So that was one of the fundamental things that I noticed about the data that came out in the data that was surprising to me.
And I like that you touched on that, because as you were saying that, it struck me too. It's like that ripple effect, right? Not
Yes.
just for that individual and how they feel and show up, but how it affects their productivity, how it affects their interaction with their coworkers and the rest of the team, but also the ripples even beyond that, as you were saying. And it was like the way they come home at night and interact with their intimate partner or their kids or people they see on the street. Like the ripple effect is so profound. Even the difference of being smiling at somebody, some stranger who's walking by you, and what that might mean for them in that moment in that day. It's such a
Mhm,
beautiful thing. So
mhm.
I'm wondering, Jennifer, what are the key, would you say, are sort of the key skills or hallmarks that make for a really great leader? And by extension, given my sort of philosophy, and also a great negotiator.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we know from research that the key characteristic of an effective leader is empathy. That's far and away number one.
Yeah.
And we also know from research that 90% of what differentiates outstanding leaders from average leaders are their set of emotional intelligence or their set of
Yes.
emotional quotient abilities. So when you look at what makes a great leader, it's someone based on that who has emotional intelligence, who
Yeah.
can demonstrate that effectively, who understands themselves and they understand others.
Yeah.
And one of the things I always, like to mention is that, I have a little bit of a different view, right? We often say that, oh, leadership is about everyone else. Well, to a certain extent, that is true. But my view is that if leadership has to be about you first,
Uh,
you have to manage yourself, you have to lead yourself, you
yeah.
have to manage those emotions, right? And then you then portray and represent and show up as this, person who understands who they are and have that confidence to then share that with the rest of the people around you so
Yeah.
that you can lead others effectively.
Yeah, and I'm smiling. I'm not laughing at what you're saying. I'm laughing because you are so simpatico, right? I mean, I always say our first and most important negotiation is with ourselves, negotiating
Yeah,
our own mindset because it affects
yeah,
everything else. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier about those beliefs. So I think that was just a great answer and a
mm,
nice shift because I think it's true about that. Yes, all the interaction with everybody else is important, and that has to start with your mindset, who you
yeah,
choose to show up as, who do you want to be seen as, all of those key questions that we often just ignore. And I was also smiling because I love that you're saying, I mean, we're saying the evidence all shows about empathy and emotional intelligence
yeah,
and that it is so true. And yet, my gosh, for so long they were seen as weaknesses, and
oh,
we're
yeah.
still having to overcome some of that, kind of speaking of mindset, right?
Yeah, well, and it still is, right? Cindy, like if you think about how we're evaluated in the workplace, right?
Yeah.
Where does EI show up on a performance review,
Yeah.
right? Where does it show up on a 360,
Yeah.
right? We don't really evaluate for that, nor do we
Yeah.
train for that.
Yeah.
So, how do people gain these skills if
Yeah.
they're not taught them, if
Yeah.
they're not trained on them, and if maybe they weren't modeled in their first families,
Yeah.
right? So, we're dealing with a set of capabilities that are extremely important to the overall performance of an organization, yet we're not equipping leaders with the tools that they need to become fluent and conversational in
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
capabilities.
Oh, and it's interesting you say about performance reviews because so much focus is on short-sighted goals, right? On the numbers. What are the numbers this quarter, as opposed to impact, right? This person may, and I often encourage, when I'm training people or coaching them about, how to negotiate for a promotion or a salary increase or for a new position, go
Mhm.
in there raising awareness about the way in which, both the tangible concrete number stuff, but also those so-called intangibles, right? Like, how
Mhm.
do you help other people perform better in the workplace? What kind of relationships do you have with customers or clients who make them want to come back? What kind of loyalty are you inspiring? And that's rarely covered on most performance evaluations, which is
Yeah,
so
yeah.
short-sighted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole nother topic we could talk on for hours
Yes.
because
Well, maybe
perform
we'll do a follow-up session on that because I can't believe how quick our time has gone.
I
And
know.
I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? That doesn't have to be at all related to what we're talking about here, Jennifer. Just one of those aha moments that has you think about something differently or show up differently.
So I would say one of the aha moments for me was being recognized by a leader. And I was 16 years into my career before this happened to me, where I was recognized as a leader and recognized as a human being, not just as an employee.
Yeah.
And that moment for me was so powerful, Cindy, like so
Yeah.
emotionally powerful that it stays with me to this day.
Yeah.
It's why I wrote the book. I tell the story about that in the book.
Yeah.
It's why I went on and did my MBA. It's why I did my PhD. And it's ultimately why I started my business so that I can help make the world a better place and help, improve leaders to be the best they can be one leader at a time.
Yeah, beautiful. Nice. And now I said we're going to have it in the show notes, but you've mentioned about your website, but just for people who are sitting there going, I need to know now, where can people learn more about you?
Sure, they can find out more about me at my website, which is drjennifernash.com. That's drjennifernash.com. And there they'll find information about the book, which is called Be Human, Lead Human: How to Connect People and Performance. And on the website is also the link for the Human Leader Index that we mentioned, which is complimentary.
Beautiful. Thank you. And like I say, we'll make sure to have that in the show notes for our listeners. So don't panic if you weren't able to get that down. And Jennifer, thanks so much for being here with us today. I mean, this was a really interesting conversation and I think so timely. So thanks for spending your time with us.
Oh, I'm so grateful for you having me on the show. Thank you so much, Cindy.
Yeah, and we'll have to do that follow-up as well. I think that might be an interesting topic as well, just on that evaluation process and maybe how we can improve that. And for our
I
listeners, I
agree.
have no doubt you got loads of value from this episode. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that. And as always, I encourage the gift of sharing. Make sure to share this episode with anyone that you think could get some benefit from this message. And since all of life is about human connection, it's kind of an important one. Who couldn't benefit from this approach? And before we sign off today, I just want to share a few ways that we can work together. If you're at a stage where you're looking to practice more on purpose and with purpose to be able to get the most out of your practice and the most out of life, to be able to negotiate your best life, then make sure to check out my programming at practicingwithpurpose.org. Or if you're looking for your firm, if you happen to be in firm management and you're looking to elevate your firm's interactions to be able to have an entire organization that practices more on purpose to get more clients with better outcomes and more satisfied staff, and within your legal practice, again, check it out at practicingwithpurpose.org. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and find ways that you can practice on purpose to find a better way to practice law so you can rekindle your passion and make a difference in the world, negotiating your best life on your terms. Until next time, take care.